I never thought my snowblower would become the most controversial piece of equipment in Meadowbrook Estates. But then again, I never anticipated dealing with Sharon Whitmore and her band of HOA zealots either. My name is Leonard Fisher, and I had been living in this cookie-cutter suburban neighborhood in Plymouth, Minnesota, for about 3 years when everything went sideways. The winters here are brutal, the kind that dump 2 feet of snow overnight and leave you trapped in your house if you're not prepared. That's exactly why I invested in a top-of-the-line Ariens Deluxe 28 snowblower the previous fall. It cost me nearly $1,500, but every penny was worth it when I could clear my driveway in 20 minutes while my neighbors spent hours with their shovels or cheap single-stage machines that constantly clogged. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning in early January. I had just finished clearing my driveway after the season's first major snowfall, about 18 inches of heavy, wet snow that had fallen overnight. My snowblower had cut through it like butter, and I was feeling pretty satisfied with myself as I guided the machine back into my shed. The shed itself was a decent-sized structure I had built shortly after moving in, tucked away in the back corner of my property, complete with a padlock to keep my tools and equipment secure. I was brushing the snow off my jacket when I heard the distinctive clip-clop of high heels on pavement. In January, in Minnesota, after a snowstorm, I knew who it was before I even turned around. Sharon Whitmore, the HOA president, was marching up my driveway in her ridiculous designer coat and impractical boots, her blonde hair styled in that aggressive soccer mom cut that screamed entitlement. She was flanked by 2 other members of the HOA board, Patricia Henderson and Deborah Collins, both equally overdressed for a snowy morning in suburbia. "Leonard," Sharon called out, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "We need to have a conversation about your snowblower." I sighed and crossed my arms. "What about it?" She gestured dramatically at the pristine path I had just cleared. "Well, it's quite impressive how quickly you managed to clear all this snow. Meanwhile, many of our elderly residents are still struggling with their driveways. Mrs. Peterson next door is 78 and she's out there with a shovel." I glanced over at Mrs. Peterson's house. Sure enough, the poor woman was slowly working her way through her driveway, though she had barely made a dent. "That's unfortunate," I said carefully. "But I offered to clear her driveway last month, and she told me she preferred to do it herself for the exercise." Sharon's smile tightened. "Be that as it may, the board has been discussing the situation, and we believe it would be beneficial for the community if you made your snowblower available for shared use." I stared at her for a long moment, certain I had misheard. "You want me to share my personal snowblower?" "The one I paid for with my own money. It's about being a good neighbor, Leonard," Patricia chimed in, adjusting her designer glasses. "We're a community here in Meadowbrook Estates. We help each other." "I do help," I said, my patience already wearing thin. "I've offered to clear driveways for several neighbors. Some accept, some don't. That's their choice." Deborah stepped forward, pulling out a folder from her oversized purse. "Actually, we've drafted a proposal. The HOA would create a schedule where residents could reserve time slots to use your snowblower. You would still be responsible for maintenance, of course, but everyone would benefit from your investment." My jaw literally dropped. "Are you serious right now? You want me to let random people use my expensive equipment? I'm responsible for fixing it when they break it, and I get nothing in return." Sharon's expression hardened. "You get the satisfaction of helping your community. Isn't that worth something?" "Not $1,500 worth," I shot back. "And definitely not worth dealing with the repairs when someone who doesn't know what they're doing runs over a rock or burns out the engine." "We could make this a formal request," Sharon said, her voice taking on a threatening edge. "The HOA has certain authorities when it comes to community welfare." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "The HOA has authority over architectural changes and landscaping. It doesn't have authority over my personal property." The answer is no. Absolutely not. Sharon's face flushed red, and for a moment I thought steam might actually come out of her ears. This is exactly the kind of selfish attitude that's destroying community values in America. "We'll be discussing this at the next board meeting." "Discuss away," I said, turning back toward my house. My answer isn't going to change. I heard them muttering among themselves as they carefully navigated back down my driveway, Sharon nearly wiping out on a patch of ice. Part of me hoped she would fall, just a little, though I immediately felt guilty for the thought. Mrs. Peterson was a sweet lady, even if she was stubborn about accepting help. That evening, I walked over to her house with a thermos of hot chocolate and my snowblower. She answered the door looking exhausted, her gray hair plastered to her forehead with sweat despite the cold. "Mr. Fisher," she said, surprised, "what brings you by?" "I thought you might like some help with the rest of your driveway," I offered. "And some hot chocolate. You look like you could use both." Her face softened and she stepped aside. "I was just about to give up for the night. My back isn't what it used to be." "Then let me take care of it. It'll take me 10 minutes, tops." By the time I finished clearing her driveway and walkway, Mrs. Peterson had put together a plate of homemade cookies for me. We sat in her warm kitchen, and she told me about the neighborhood before the HOA had gotten so aggressive, back when people helped each other without someone forcing them to share their belongings. "Sharon means well," Mrs. Peterson said diplomatically, "but she has a way of taking things too far. Last year, she tried to institute a rule about what color Christmas lights we could use. Can you imagine? Only white lights allowed. She said colored lights were tacky." I shook my head. "How did that go over?" "About as well as you'd expect. Half the neighborhood put up the gaudiest displays they could manage just to spite her. The rule quietly disappeared after that." She patted my hand. "Don't let her bully you about that snowblower. You worked hard for your money, and you have every right to protect your investment." I thanked her and headed home, feeling better about my decision. The next few days passed quietly, and I almost forgot about the whole incident. Then the HOA newsletter arrived in my mailbox. The Meadowbrook Estates monthly newsletter was usually a boring affair, filled with reminders about trash pickup schedules and updates on landscaping contracts. This month's edition, however, featured a prominent article titled "The Importance of Community Sharing" that was clearly directed at me, even though I wasn't mentioned by name. The article waxed poetic about how some residents selfishly hoarded resources while their neighbors struggled, and how a true community member would gladly share their tools and equipment for the greater good. It went on to cite examples from other neighborhoods where tool-sharing programs had been implemented successfully, complete with statistics about community satisfaction and property values. The kicker came at the end. The board is currently exploring options to incentivize equipment sharing among residents, including potential amendments to the HOA bylaws that would require owners of high-value community beneficial items to make them available to neighbors in need. I read the article 3 times, my blood pressure rising with each pass. They were actually threatening to change the bylaws to force me to share my snowblower. I immediately pulled out my copy of the current HOA bylaws and started reading through the sections on amendments and community property. The good news was that any bylaw amendment required a vote of all homeowners, not just the board. The bad news was that Sharon and her cronies were already starting their propaganda campaign to turn the neighborhood against me. Over the next week, I noticed the shift. Neighbors who had always been friendly suddenly gave me cold looks when I cleared my driveway. Someone left a note on my car that said, "Sharing is caring," in aggressive all caps. I even got an anonymous message slipped under my door accusing me of being a terrible neighbor and suggesting I should move if I couldn't be part of the community. The whole situation was absurd. I had never refused to help anyone who actually asked. But now, I was being painted as some kind of villain because I wouldn't let the HOA turn my personal property into a community resource. The board meeting was scheduled for the last Thursday of January. I marked it on my calendar and started preparing my defense. I printed out receipts showing what I had paid for the snowblower, research on average repair costs, and documentation of every time I had voluntarily helped a neighbor. I also did some digging into the legal precedents for HOA authority over personal property. What I found was encouraging. Unless my snowblower somehow violated existing covenants or bylaws, which it obviously didn't, the HOA had no legal standing to force me to share it. They could ask, they could guilt trip, but they couldn't compel. The day of the meeting, I arrived at the community center 15 minutes early. The room was already packed. Apparently, Sharon had been doing her homework too, rallying supporters to show up and create pressure. Sharon called the meeting to order and went through the usual mundane business with practiced efficiency. Then she got to what she called new business. As many of you know, we've been discussing the concept of community resource sharing, she began, projecting a PowerPoint presentation onto the wall. With the increasing cost of equipment like snowblowers, lawn mowers, and pressure washers, it makes financial sense for neighbors to pool their resources. She clicked through several slides showing cost comparisons and theoretical savings. It all looked very official and reasonable if you didn't think about the reality of what she was proposing. The board would like to propose a trial program, Sharon continued. Residents who own equipment valued at over $1,000 would register it with the HOA. Other residents could then request to borrow this equipment for up to 4 hours at a time. The owner would maintain the equipment, but the HOA would provide insurance coverage in case of damage. Several people nodded along. It did sound reasonable when she put it that way. But I knew the insurance coverage was a lie. No insurance company would cover that kind of arrangement without massive premiums that the HOA wasn't going to pay. When she finished, I raised my hand. Sharon's expression soured, but she had to acknowledge me. "Leonard, do you have a question?" I stood up so everyone could see me. "I have several. First, has the HOA actually secured insurance coverage for this program, and if so, what's the deductible and coverage limit?" Sharon blinked. "We're still finalizing the details." "So that's a no," I said flatly. Second question. What happens when someone damages equipment? Let's say someone borrows my $1,500 snowblower and runs over a rock, cracking the auger housing. That's a $500 repair. Who pays? The borrower would be responsible. Patricia jumped in. And when they refuse or claim they didn't cause the damage, what's the enforcement mechanism? Silence. Third question, I continued. What about liability? If someone gets injured using my equipment, am I liable as the owner, even if I wasn't present and had no control over how they used it? Now people were starting to murmur. These were questions they hadn't considered. The HOA would indemnify owners, Sharon said, but her confidence was wavering. With what money? Our HOA dues are $200 a year. That barely covers the landscaping contract and newsletter printing. You're going to get liability insurance that covers potentially dozens of pieces of expensive equipment being used by untrained people. What's that going to cost, and how much are you planning to raise our dues? The murmuring grew louder. Sharon's face was getting red. "This is about community," she snapped. "This is about neighbors helping neighbors instead of hoarding resources." "I don't hoard anything," I said, keeping my voice level. "I've personally cleared Mrs. Peterson's driveway 6 times this winter. I've offered to help 3 other neighbors. I've never refused anyone who actually asked for help. What I refuse to do is hand over my expensive equipment to be abused by people who have no investment in maintaining it, with no real protection against damage or liability, just so the HOA board can feel good about forcing people to be generous." "That's not what this is about," Deborah protested. "Then what is it about?" I challenged. "Because from where I'm standing, this entire proposal came about because I said no when you demanded access to my snowblower. This isn't about community. This is about control." An older gentleman in the back stood up. I recognized him as Robert Martinez, who lived 3 streets over. "I have to say, Leonard makes some good points. I've got a pretty expensive riding mower, and I'm not excited about the idea of someone else tearing it up and me being stuck with the repair bill." A woman near the front raised her hand. "I bought a pressure washer last year. It cost me $800. If this passes, would mine qualify for the program?" Sharon hesitated. "Potentially, yes." "Then I vote no," the woman said firmly. "I worked overtime to afford that pressure washer. It's mine." The meeting devolved into chaos after that, with people shouting questions and concerns. Sharon tried to regain control, but the damage was done. When she finally called for a vote on implementing the trial program, it was voted down by a margin of nearly 3-1. I left the meeting feeling vindicated but also uneasy. Sharon had shot me a look of pure hatred as I walked out, and I had a feeling this wasn't over. I was right. 2 weeks later, I woke up on a Saturday morning to find my shed door hanging open. My heart sank as I pulled on my boots and ran outside. The padlock had been cut clean through, and inside, the space where my snowblower normally sat was empty. Someone had stolen my snowblower. I immediately called the police. The Plymouth Police Department sent an officer out within an hour. Officer Derek Thompson was a middle-aged guy with a no-nonsense demeanor who took detailed notes as I explained the situation. "Any security cameras?" he asked, looking around my yard. "No," I admitted. "I never thought I'd need them in this neighborhood." "You'd be surprised how common theft is in suburban areas," Thompson said. "People assume they're safe and don't take basic precautions." "Do you have the serial number for the snowblower?" I did, thankfully. I had kept all the paperwork from the purchase. I gave him the serial number, make, model, and a detailed description. "I'll file the report," Thompson said. "Check with your neighbors to see if anyone saw anything, and honestly, get some cameras. They're cheap these days and they'll save you a lot of headaches." After he left, I started knocking on doors. Most of my neighbors were sympathetic but hadn't seen anything. Then I got to Craig Davidson's house, 2 doors down. Craig was a retired accountant who spent most of his time working in his garden or watching the neighborhood from his front window. "Someone took my snowblower last night," I told him. "Did you happen to see anyone around my property?" Craig's expression grew uncomfortable. "I saw Sharon Whitmore's car parked on the street near your house around 11. I thought it was odd because she doesn't live on this block." My stomach dropped. "Did you see her doing anything?" "I didn't see her specifically, just her car. It's that silver Lexus SUV with the vanity plate that says HOA Pres, hard to miss." I thanked Craig and walked back to my house, my mind racing. Sharon wouldn't be stupid enough to steal my snowblower herself, would she? But then again, she had shown increasingly poor judgment lately. I called Officer Thompson back and told him what Craig had seen. He said he'd look into it but warned me that seeing a car on the street wasn't proof of anything. The next day, We got another massive snowfall, nearly 2 feet of heavy snow that shut down most of the metro area. I was stuck shoveling my driveway by hand, a miserable 4-hour process that left my back screaming. As I worked, I noticed several of my neighbors having their driveways mysteriously cleared by someone with a snowblower that sounded exactly like mine. I followed the sound and found myself 3 streets over, watching as Gary Nelson, one of Sharon's closest allies on the HOA board, used what was unmistakably my snowblower to clear a driveway. I recognized the distinctive orange paint chip on the side panel, damage from when I had accidentally bumped it against my workbench a few months ago. I marched up to Gary, my anger overriding any sense of caution. "That's my snowblower." Gary looked up, startled. "What?" "No, this is the community snowblower." "The what?" "The HOA acquired a snowblower for community use," he said, avoiding my eyes. "Sharon arranged it." "Sharon arranged to steal my snowblower, you mean?" I pulled out my phone and took several photos of the machine, making sure to capture the orange paint chip and the serial number plate. "See this serial number? I've got the police report with this exact number listed as stolen property. You're currently in possession of stolen goods." Gary's face went white. "I didn't know. Sharon said she got it through a community donation. She lied. And unless you want to be charged as an accessory to theft, I suggest you tell me exactly where she's keeping it when it's not in use." Gary practically tripped over himself to talk. Apparently, Sharon had convinced him and a few other board members that I had donated the snowblower to the community after having a change of heart. She had been storing it in the community center's storage shed and distributing it to board members to clear driveways of elderly residents, painting herself as a hero in the process. I called Officer Thompson again. This time, I had evidence. The officer met me at the community center, along with a second officer for backup. They retrieved my snowblower from the storage shed, confirmed the serial number matched, and then went to have a conversation with Sharon Whitmore. I wasn't present for that initial conversation, but Officer Thompson called me that evening to fill me in. "She's sticking to the story that you donated it," he said. "Claims she has a verbal agreement from you." "That's a complete lie," I said. "I have witnesses from the board meeting who heard me explicitly refuse to participate in any equipment sharing program." "I believe you," Thompson said, "but proving theft is going to be tricky if she keeps claiming it was a donation. However, she did break into your shed to take it, which is criminal damage to property at minimum, and the cut padlock shows forced entry. I've recommended that the prosecutor charge her with burglary. What happens now? The case gets reviewed by the prosecutor's office. They'll decide whether to file charges. In the meantime, keep your snowblower locked up tight. If you can get those cameras installed, do it." I took his advice. That weekend, I installed a comprehensive security camera system covering my entire property, with special attention to the shed. The cameras had motion detection, night vision, and cloud storage. If anyone came near my property again, I'd have evidence. For a few weeks, things were quiet. My snowblower was back in my possession. My shed had a new, more robust lock, and I was carefully documenting every interaction I had with Sharon and the HOA board. Then the harassment started. It began subtly. I received a formal violation notice from the HOA claiming my trash cans were visible from the street, which violated the covenants. I had been putting my trash cans in the same spot for 3 years without issue, but now suddenly it was a problem. The notice threatened fines of $50 per day if I didn't correct the violation. I moved the trash cans 6 inches to the left, technically behind my fence line, and sent Sharon a certified letter with photographic evidence that the violation had been corrected. 3 days later, I got another violation notice. This time, they claimed my lawn furniture violated the color scheme requirements in the covenants. I read through the covenants again. There was no color scheme requirement for lawn furniture. I sent another certified letter pointing this out. Then they claimed my mailbox was the wrong shade of black. Then they said my house numbers were too large. Then they decided my garden gnome was an unauthorized lawn ornament. Each violation came with the same threat of $50 daily fines. Each one was either completely fabricated or based on such a ridiculous interpretation of the covenants that it would never hold up under scrutiny. But Sharon was counting on me either getting frustrated and moving or making a mistake she could exploit. I documented everything. Every violation notice, every photograph, every certified letter I sent in response. I also started researching HOA law in Minnesota, and I learned something interesting. If an HOA engaged in selective enforcement of rules or harassment of a homeowner, the homeowner could sue for damages and legal fees. I consulted with an attorney named Michael Rodriguez who specialized in HOA disputes. He reviewed my documentation and whistled low. "This is pretty blatant harassment," he said. "Especially given the context of the Snowblower incident. You've got a strong case. What are my options?" "You could sue the HOA for harassment and selective enforcement. Given the pattern here, you'd likely win and recover your legal fees plus damages. Or you could file a complaint with the state attorney general's office. They take HOA abuse seriously." "How much would a lawsuit cost?" "I'd charge a flat fee of $5,000 plus costs. But if we win, which I'm confident we would, the HOA would have to reimburse all of that plus pay you damages." I thought about it. $5,000 was a lot of money, but I was tired of being bullied. "Let me think about it," I told him. That night, I reviewed my security camera footage from the past few weeks, just to see if I had missed anything. What I found made my blood run cold. The footage showed Sharon and Patricia walking around my property at 2 in the morning, taking photographs of my house from every angle. In one clip, Patricia actually stepped onto my property and tried my shed door, checking to see if it was locked. In another, Sharon could be seen examining my mailbox up close with a flashlight, clearly looking for something she could cite as a violation. They had been trespassing on my property in the middle of the night, gathering evidence for their bogus violation notices. I immediately downloaded all the footage and sent copies to Officer Thompson, my attorney, and saved multiple backups. This was evidence of criminal trespassing, and it showed a clear pattern of harassment. Michael Rodriguez called me the next day, excited. "This footage is gold. It proves malicious intent and shows they're actively trying to manufacture violations. If you want to move forward with the lawsuit, we should file immediately." "Do it," I said. I was done playing nice. The lawsuit hit the HOA like a bomb. I was suing Sharon Whitmore personally, along with Patricia Henderson and Deborah Collins in their capacity as board members, as well as the HOA itself. The suit claimed harassment, selective enforcement of covenants, trespassing, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. I was seeking $15,000 in damages, plus legal fees. Sharon's response was to call an emergency HOA meeting to discuss baseless litigation by a problem resident. The meeting was scheduled for a Wednesday evening, and I made sure to attend. The community center was packed again, but this time the energy was different. Word had gotten around about the lawsuit, and people were starting to ask questions about what the board had been doing. Sharon opened the meeting by painting herself as the victim. Leonard Fisher has filed a frivolous lawsuit against your HOA board, which means he's effectively suing every homeowner in this community. His actions could cost us tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees and potentially raise everyone's HOA dues significantly. Several people looked at me with concern. I raised my hand. "I'm not suing the homeowners," I said loudly. "I'm suing the board members for harassment and abuse of power. And before Sharon tries to paint this as frivolous, let me show everyone what's actually been happening." I had brought my laptop and a projector. I quickly set up and started showing the documentation, the timeline of bogus violation notices, the photographs showing how I had been in compliance with all actual covenant requirements, the comparison showing that other homeowners had similar or identical situations, but had never been cited for violations. Then, I showed the security camera footage of Sharon and Patricia trespassing on my property at 2 in the morning. The room erupted. People were shocked, angry, and directing most of that anger at Sharon. "You were on his property at 2 in the morning," someone shouted. "That's creepy as hell," another person added. Sharon tried to regain control. "I was conducting a routine inspection for covenant compliance." "At 2 in the morning," Robert Martinez called out. "That's not routine. That's stalking." I let the chaos continue for a moment before speaking again. "This all started because I refused to let the HOA take my snowblower for community use. When I said no, Sharon Whitmore broke into my shed and stole it. When I got it back and filed a police report, she started this campaign of harassment to either force me out of the neighborhood or punish me for not going along with her demands. This isn't about community. This is about a power-hungry HOA president who can't handle being told no." "That's a lie," Sharon screamed, but nobody was listening to her anymore. Craig Davidson stood up. "I saw Sharon's car parked near Leonard's house the night his snowblower was stolen. I told the police that, Mrs. Peterson raised her hand. "Sharon told me Leonard refused to help anyone with their driveways, but he's cleared mine at least a dozen times this winter without me even asking. He's been nothing but kind." More people started speaking up, sharing their own experiences with Sharon's aggressive enforcement of rules, her selective application of violations, and her generally controlling behavior. It turned out I wasn't the only one who had problems with her. I was just the first one to fight back. The meeting ended with a motion to hold a special election to recall the entire HOA board. The motion passed overwhelmingly. 2 days later, I got a call from the Plymouth Police Department. Officer Thompson had good news. "The prosecutor's office has decided to file charges," he said. "Sharon Whitmore is being charged with burglary in the 3rd degree and criminal damage to property. Patricia Henderson is being charged as an accessory after the fact for helping store the stolen property." What does that mean for them? Burglary in the 3rd degree is a felony in Minnesota. If convicted, Sharon could face up to 5 years in prison and a $10,000 fine, though realistically, as a first offender, she'd probably get probation and community service. But it'll be on her record. I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness. I hadn't wanted to ruin Sharon's life. I had just wanted her to leave me alone, but she had brought this on herself. The criminal case moved slowly through the system. In the meantime, the special HOA election was held and a completely new board was voted in. The new president was Robert Martinez, who immediately reached out to me to apologize for everything that had happened. "None of that should have happened," he said when we met for coffee. "The board is supposed to serve the community, not terrorize residents. We're going to do a complete review of how violations are handled and implement an appeals process so nothing like this can happen again." "I appreciate that," I said. I never wanted to be the problem neighbor. I just wanted to be left alone to use my own property in peace. You weren't the problem, Robert assured me. Sharon was. She had a vision of what this neighborhood should be, and she couldn't handle it when reality didn't match up. She turned the HOA into her personal fiefdom, and we all let it happen because it was easier than confronting her. My lawsuit was settled out of court 6 months later. The HOA's insurance company agreed to pay my legal fees and damages, totaling $18,000. Sharon, Patricia, and Deborah were required to personally contribute $5,000 each to the settlement, and were barred from serving on the HOA board for the next 10 years. The criminal case took longer. Sharon fought the charges hard, hiring an expensive defense attorney who tried every trick in the book to get the case dismissed. But the evidence was overwhelming. The cut padlock, the security footage, Craig's testimony about seeing her car, and Gary's statement about how Sharon had lied to him about the snowblower being donated. The trial was held in March of the following year. I had to testify, walking the jury through the entire saga from the initial demand to share my snowblower to discovering it had been stolen from my shed. The prosecutor did an excellent job of painting a picture of escalating harassment and entitlement. Sharon's defense was essentially that she had been trying to help the community, and that she genuinely believed I had agreed to donate the snowblower. Her attorney tried to portray her as a well-meaning community volunteer who had made an honest mistake. The jury didn't buy it. They deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a guilty verdict on both counts. The judge sentenced Sharon to 2 years of probation, 300 hours of community service, and ordered her to pay restitution for the damaged padlock and my legal fees from the criminal case. She was also ordered to write a formal letter of apology to me, which she delivered through her attorney rather than face me in person. The letter was perfunctory and clearly written by her lawyer, but I didn't care. The ordeal was finally over. Life in Meadowbrook Estates slowly returned to normal after that. The new HOA board was reasonable and focused on actual community improvement rather than petty enforcement of arbitrary rules. They organized genuine community events, negotiated better rates on landscaping services, and implemented a volunteer-based snow removal program where people could sign up to help elderly or disabled neighbors, but participation was entirely voluntary. I continued to help Mrs. Peterson with her driveway, and I started helping a few other neighbors too. But it was on my terms, using my equipment, done because I wanted to help, not because anyone forced me to. Sharon Whitmore moved away about 6 months after her conviction. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she and her husband had divorced, partially due to the stress and embarrassment from the criminal case. I felt a twinge of sympathy, but mostly I just felt relief that she was gone. Patricia Henderson kept a low profile after the scandal. She still lived in the neighborhood, but stayed far away from HOA politics. Deborah Collins actually approached me at a neighborhood barbecue that summer to apologize in person. I got caught up in Sharon's vision, she admitted. She had this way of making you feel like you were part of something important, like we were protecting property values and community standards. I didn't realize we had become the bullies until I saw all that evidence laid out. I'm sorry for my part in what happened to you. I accepted her apology. Deborah had been a follower, not a leader in the harassment, and she seemed genuinely remorseful. The whole experience taught me several valuable lessons. First, HOAs can be wonderful when run by reasonable people focused on genuine community improvement, but they can become instruments of tyranny when power-hungry individuals take control. Second, documentation is everything. If I hadn't kept meticulous records of every violation notice, every interaction, and every piece of evidence, I wouldn't have been able to defend myself effectively. Third, security cameras are worth every penny. The footage from those cameras had been crucial in proving the trespassing and establishing the pattern of harassment. But perhaps the most important lesson was about standing up for yourself. It would have been easier to just give in to Sharon's initial demand to share my snowblower. It would have saved me months of stress, thousands of dollars in legal fees that I had to front before getting reimbursed, and countless hours dealing with police reports and court proceedings. But giving in would have set a terrible precedent. It would have told Sharon and the HOA board that they could bully residents into doing whatever they wanted. It would have encouraged more abuse of power, more overreach, and more harassment of anyone who dared to say no. By fighting back, I didn't just protect my own property and rights. I exposed a corrupt system and led to meaningful reforms that benefited the entire community. Other residents later told me that they had been dealing with their own harassment from Sharon, but had been too afraid to speak up. My lawsuit had given them the courage to share their stories and demand change. The following winter, I was out clearing my driveway after the first major snowfall of the season. My trusty Arian snowblower was running perfectly, cutting through the snow with satisfying efficiency. As I made my final pass, I noticed Mrs. Peterson watching from her window. I waved, and she waved back. When I finished my driveway, I guided the snowblower over to hers and cleared her driveway too, along with her walkway and the area around her mailbox. It took me an extra 15 minutes, and I did it gladly. As I was finishing up, Robert Martinez walked over from his house, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you might need this," he said, handing me one. "Thanks," I said, taking a grateful sip. The coffee was perfect, hot and strong. "You know," Robert said, looking around at the quiet, snow-covered street, "this neighborhood is a better place because you stood up to Sharon. A lot of people are grateful, even if they haven't said it directly." "I just wanted to keep my snowblower," I said with a laugh. "You did more than that. You reminded us that community doesn't mean surrendering your autonomy. It means choosing to help each other, not being forced to." We stood there for a moment, drinking our coffee and watching the neighborhood slowly come to life as people emerged to deal with the snow. A few houses down, I saw Craig Davidson waving at us. Further up the street, a young family was building a snowman in their front yard, their children's laughter carrying on the cold air. This was what community was supposed to be. People living their lives, respecting boundaries and helping each other when needed. Not forced sharing, not manufactured violations, not harassment and power trips. My phone buzzed with a text from my brother in Colorado asking how I was doing after the Great HOA War, as he called it. I texted back that everything was fine now, that life was peaceful and boring in the best possible way. Robert finished his coffee and headed back to his house, and I guided my snowblower back to my shed. The new padlock gleamed in the winter sunlight, and the security cameras mounted on the corners of the shed kept watch. Some people might have thought I was paranoid for keeping the security system even after Sharon was gone, but I preferred to think of it as being prepared. I locked the shed, checked that my cameras were recording properly, and headed inside to warm up. As I pulled off my boots in the mudroom, I reflected on how different things could have been if I had just said yes that first day when Sharon demanded access to my snowblower. I would have avoided a lot of trouble, sure, but I also would have lost something important, my self-respect and my right to control my own property. Some battles are worth fighting, even when they are over something as seemingly trivial as a snowblower. That evening, I got an email from the new HOA board with the minutes from their latest meeting. They had approved a new covenant amendment that explicitly prohibited the HOA from requiring residents to share personal property and established strict guidelines for when and how violation notices could be issued. The amendment had been proposed by Mrs. Peterson and passed unanimously. I smiled as I read through the new rules. They were reasonable, clear, and designed to prevent exactly the kind of abuse I had experienced. It felt good to know that something positive had come from all the conflict. A few days later, another major snowstorm hit the Twin Cities area. This one was particularly bad, with high winds creating massive drifts and white-out conditions. The city issued a snow emergency, and everyone was encouraged to stay home unless absolutely necessary. I spent the morning clearing my driveway, though it was a losing battle with the wind constantly refilling it with snow. As I worked, I noticed several of my neighbors struggling with their own driveways. The wind was making it nearly impossible to make any progress. I made a decision. I finished my own driveway, then went door to door on my street, offering to help anyone who needed it. Most people gratefully accepted. Over the next 4 hours, I cleared 8 driveways, including Mrs. Peterson's, 2 other elderly couples, and several families with young children. My back was killing me by the time I finished, and my snowblower was caked with ice and snow, but I felt good. This was what helping your community was supposed to feel like. Not forced, not mandated, but freely chosen. As I was putting my snowblower away, one of the families I had helped, the Johnsons, came walking up my driveway with a hot pizza. "We figured you'd be too tired to cook after all that work," Mrs. Johnson said with a warm smile. "It's the least we can do to say thank you." I tried to protest that it wasn't necessary, but Mr. Johnson shook his head. "You spent 4 hours helping your neighbors in terrible conditions. Let us do this small thing for you." I accepted the pizza gratefully and invited them in for a few minutes to warm up. We sat in my kitchen, eating pizza and talking about the storm, the neighborhood, and how much things had improved since the new board had taken over. "My husband wanted to help you clear driveways today, Mrs. Johnson said, but we don't have a snowblower, and shoveling in this wind would have been pointless." "You know," I said, an idea forming, "maybe the HOA could actually buy a community snowblower. A real one owned by the HOA that people could check out when they need it. It would be a legitimate community resource that everyone paid for through dues." Mr. Johnson's eyes lit up. "That's a great idea. We could store it at the community center, have a sign-up sheet, maybe charge a small fee to cover maintenance. I'll bring it up at the next board meeting," Mrs. Johnson said. She had been elected to the board in the most recent election. "It's exactly the kind of practical improvement we should be focused on." The idea was implemented 3 months later. The HOA purchased a good quality snowblower using a small portion of the reserve fund, established a checkout system, and set up a maintenance schedule. It wasn't as nice as my personal snowblower, but it was perfectly adequate for occasional use, and it gave residents who couldn't afford their own equipment a real option for dealing with heavy snow. The irony wasn't lost on me. The HOA had eventually gotten their community snowblower, but they had done it the right way. By purchasing it with community funds, establishing proper systems for use and maintenance, and respecting everyone's property rights in the process. Looking back on the entire saga, I realized that Sharon's biggest mistake wasn't wanting to help the community or even wanting access to my snowblower. Her mistake was thinking she could force people to be generous, that she could mandate community spirit through rules and threats. Real community, real generosity, real cooperation, none of that can be forced. It has to be freely given or it means nothing. That spring, I decided to expand my vegetable garden. I had been growing tomatoes and peppers in a small plot for years, but I wanted to try something more ambitious. As I was planning the layout, Mrs. Peterson came over with a basket of seed packets. "My late husband and I used to have a huge garden," she said. "I can't manage it anymore, but I hate to see all these seeds go to waste. Would you like them?" I accepted gratefully, and we spent an afternoon planning out my garden together. She shared tips her husband had learned over decades of gardening, and I promised to share the harvest with her. Over the next few months, several other neighbors got involved in the garden project. Craig Davidson helped me build raised beds. The Johnsons contributed compost from their yard waste. Robert Martinez's wife, who was a master gardener, advised on crop rotation and pest management. By midsummer, my backyard had been transformed into a thriving garden that produced far more vegetables than I could use myself. I started leaving baskets of tomatoes, cucumbers, and zucchini on neighbors' porches, and soon other people were doing the same with their excess produce. Nobody mandated it. Nobody made a rule about it. It happened organically, pun intended, because people wanted to share and contribute. That's what Sharon had never understood. You can't force people to be good neighbors. You can only create an environment where good neighborliness can flourish, and then get out of the way. As autumn arrived and I began preparing for another winter, I made sure my snowblower was serviced and ready. I also bought a backup shovel and a spare can of gas, just in case. The forecast was predicting another brutal winter, but I was ready. The first snow came in early November, just a few inches that barely required the snowblower. I cleared my driveway quickly, then did Mrs. Peterson's as usual. As I was finishing up, I saw the new HOA newsletter in my mailbox. The front page featured an article about emergency preparedness for winter, with practical tips about insulation, heating systems, and snow removal. It was useful, informative, and free of any passive-aggressive guilt trips or demands. It was what an HOA newsletter should be. I went inside, made myself a cup of hot coffee, and settled onto my couch with a book. Outside, the snow continued to fall softly, blanketing the neighborhood in white. My snowblower sat safe and secure in my shed, protected by a good lock and watchful cameras. Everything was as it should be. The winter passed without incident. I cleared my driveway dozens of times, helped various neighbors, and occasionally borrowed the community snowblower for anyone who asked nicely. Life in Meadowbrook Estates had finally found its equilibrium. On a clear day in March, as the snow was beginning to melt and the first hints of spring were appearing, I ran into Officer Thompson at the grocery store. We chatted for a few minutes, and he told me that my case had become something of a teaching example at the police academy. "We use it to show officers how to handle HOA disputes," he explained. "A lot of people don't realize that HOAs can't just do whatever they want. They have limits, and when they cross those limits, it becomes a criminal matter. Your case made that really clear." "I'm glad something good came from it," I said. "More than you know," Thompson replied. "We've seen a significant decrease in HOA-related complaints in Plymouth over the past year. Word got around that boards can face real consequences for abuse of power. You changed the dynamic." As I drove home with my groceries, I thought about what Thompson had said. I hadn't set out to change anything or make a statement. I had just wanted to protect my property and be left alone. But sometimes, standing up for yourself becomes standing up for a principle, and that principle resonates with others. The following weekend, the neighborhood held its annual spring barbecue. It was a beautiful afternoon, warm and sunny, with the kind of fresh breeze that makes you grateful winter is over. The event was held in the common area near the community center, and nearly everyone in the neighborhood showed up. I brought potato salad and hamburgers to contribute to the potluck. Mrs. Peterson brought her famous chocolate chip cookies. The Johnsons brought their specialty ribs. Craig brought enough beer for a small army. As the afternoon wore on and the food disappeared, Robert Martinez called for everyone's attention. He stood on a picnic table, slightly unsteady but grinning widely. "I just want to say a few words," he announced. "A year ago, this neighborhood was not in a good place. We had a board that thought control was more important than community. We had rules that didn't make sense and enforcement that was arbitrary and mean-spirited. A lot of people were unhappy, but we were all too comfortable to do anything about it." He paused and looked directly at me. Then one person decided he wasn't going to just go along with it. Leonard Fisher stood up for his rights, and in doing so, he gave the rest of us the courage to demand better. He fought back against harassment and abuse of power, and he won. This neighborhood is better because of him. People started clapping, and I felt my face getting red. I wasn't comfortable being the center of attention, but Robert wasn't finished. "So I want to propose a toast," he said, raising his beer. "To Leonard Fisher, to standing up for what's right, and to a community that's built on respect and choice, not force and fear. Cheers! Cheers!" Everyone shouted, raising their drinks. I raised my own beer in acknowledgement, feeling genuinely touched. After the toast, several people came up to thank me personally or share their own stories about dealing with Sharon's board. It was cathartic for all of us, I think, to acknowledge what had happened and celebrate moving past it. As the sun began to set and the barbecue wound down, I helped clean up and then walked home with Mrs. Peterson. She was moving slowly, her arthritis acting up, but she refused my offer to drive her the 2 blocks to her house. "I need the exercise," she insisted. "Besides, it's such a beautiful evening." We walked in comfortable silence for a while before she spoke again. "You know, Leonard, when you first moved to this neighborhood, I wasn't sure what to make of you. You kept to yourself, didn't come to many events. I thought maybe you were unfriendly." "I'm just introverted," I said with a laugh. "I know that now," she said. "But here's what I learned. Being a good neighbor has nothing to do with how many events you attend or how social you are. It's about integrity. It's about helping when you can, standing up for what's right, and treating people with respect. You showed all of us what that really means." We reached her house, and I waited to make sure she got inside safely. As I walked the rest of the way home, I reflected on her words. I had never thought of myself as particularly principled or brave. I had just been a guy who wanted to keep his snowblower and not be bullied by an overzealous HOA board. But sometimes, that's enough. Sometimes, the simple act of saying no to unreasonable demands and standing your ground is exactly what's needed to spark change. I reached my house and paused in the driveway, looking at my home in the fading light. It wasn't anything special, just a standard 3-bedroom colonial in a suburban development. But it was mine. I had worked hard to afford it, to maintain it, and to make it a home. And nobody, not Sharon Whitmore, not the HOA board, not anyone, had the right to tell me what I could and couldn't do with my own property, as long as I wasn't harming anyone else or violating reasonable rules. That was worth fighting for. That was worth all the stress, the legal fees, the time, and the energy I had invested in standing up for myself. I went inside, fed my cat, and settled in for a quiet evening. My snowblower sat in the shed, ready for whatever next winter would bring. My security cameras kept watch. My relationship with my neighbors was better than ever. And the HOA was finally functioning the way it was supposed to, serving the community rather than ruling over it. Life was good. The battle had been worth it, and if I had to do it all over again, I wouldn't change a thing. As spring turned to summer and summer faded into fall, I watched my neighborhood continue to grow and improve. The community garden expanded. New families moved in and were welcomed warmly. The HOA board made thoughtful decisions that actually benefited residents rather than restricting them. And through it all, my snowblower sat in my shed, waiting patiently for the next snow. It was just a machine, a tool for clearing driveways. But it had become a symbol of something much larger: the right to own property, the right to say no, and the right to be treated with respect by those in authority. When the first snow finally fell again in November, I fired up my snowblower and cleared my driveway with a smile on my face. Then I cleared Mrs. Peterson's driveway and Mr. Davidson's and anyone else who needed help. Because I wanted to. Because it was the right thing to do. Because that's what good neighbors do for each other. Not because anyone forced me to, but because I chose to. And that made all the difference.